For over 5,000 years, one river decided who would live and who would starve. No rain fell on its banks for months at a time. The land around it was pure desert, cracked, lifeless, silent. And yet, every single year, like clockwork, the water rose. Fields turned green, crops grew. An entire civilization was born out of nothing but sand and one impossible river. The ancient Egyptians worshipped it. They built their calendar around it. They even had a god, just for its flood. But here's the strange part. For over 2,000 years, no one on Earth knew where this river actually came from. Kings sent expeditions. Emperors offered rewards. Explorers vanished trying to find the answer. And when scientists finally solved the mystery, what they found was even more unbelievable than the legends. This is the story of the Nile, and why it might be the strangest river on the planet. The Nile is not just a river, it's the reason an entire civilization exists at all. Stretching over 4,000 miles, it cuts through 11 countries, feeds hundreds of millions of people, and somehow, in the middle of one of the driest regions on Earth, it never runs dry. For the ancient Egyptians, this wasn't just geography. It was survival. It was religion. It was the difference between famine and abundance. But the true secret behind the Nile, how it forms, why it floods, and where its water truly begins, took modern science centuries to unravel. And once you understand what's really happening beneath the surface of this river, you'll never look at a simple map of Africa the same way again. Let's begin. A desert river with no business surviving. Picture the map of northeastern Africa. Vast stretches of the Sahara, one of the harshest, driest deserts on the planet. Almost no rainfall, almost no vegetation. A landscape that, by every rule of nature, should be completely dead. And running straight through the middle of it, a river so powerful it built an entire empire. That contradiction is the first mystery of the Nile. Because unlike most major rivers, which are fed by rainfall along their own banks, the Nile receives almost none of its water from the desert it flows through. Egypt itself gets less than an inch of rain per year in most regions. So the question ancient people asked, and the question that puzzled scholars for millennia, was simple. If it doesn't rain here, where does all this water come from? The ancient Egyptians didn't have an answer, so they created one. They believed the god Hapi lived in a cave near the first cataract, and that he personally controlled the flood, releasing water from the underworld each year as a gift to the living. It's a beautiful myth. But myths are usually built to explain something science hasn't caught up with yet. And in this case, the real explanation was hiding thousands of miles away, in a completely different country. On the other side of a mountain range most Egyptians had never even heard of. The truth wasn't underground at all. It was in the sky. If you're enjoying uncovering mysteries like this one, make sure you're subscribed to the most predictable disaster in human history. Every year, without fail, the Nile would rise. Not randomly, precisely. Ancient Egyptian priests could predict the flood almost to the week. And when it came, it didn't destroy their land. It saved it. The water would spill over the riverbanks, spread across the fields, and then slowly retreat, leaving behind a thick layer of black, mineral-rich silt. That silt was gold. It replenished the soil year after year, allowing the same fields to be farmed for thousands of years without ever wearing out. In fact, the ancient Egyptians called their own country Kemet, the Black Land. named directly after this fertile black soil the flood left behind. They even built devices called nilometers, stone structures with carved markings along the riverbanks, just to measure exactly how high the flood would rise each year. Too low, and the harvest would fail. Too high, and villages would be destroyed. The height of a single flood could determine whether a pharaoh's reign was remembered as prosperous or cursed. But here's where it gets genuinely strange. This flood wasn't caused by anything happening in Egypt at all. It was caused by monsoon rains, falling over 1,000 miles away in the highlands of a completely different country, Ethiopia. Each summer, seasonal rains would batter the Ethiopian highlands with such intensity that the runoff would gather into a river of its own, the Blue Nile, and come crashing down towards Sudan and Egypt, carrying with it tons of dark volcanic sediment. That sediment is exactly what turned the water black. That's exactly what fed the fields, and the Egyptians who depended on it completely had no idea it was happening. They were living off a rainstorm they would never see, in a country most of them would never visit, controlled by a climate system they didn't even know existed. And if you've made it this far, drop a comment and let me know. Did you already know the Nile's flood came from Ethiopia? Or is this the first time you're hearing it? Because if the flood only came once a year, fed by monsoon rains falling on a mountain range 1,000 miles away, then what happened the rest of the time? What happened in the dry months? When no rain fell over Ethiopia? When the highlands went silent? When, by every rule of nature, the river should have slowed and kept slowing until there was nothing left? For thousands of years, nobody asked that question. The flood came, the flood went, and somehow, the river was always still there. But when modern researchers finally looked closer, what they found didn't just answer the question, it stunned them. Even during the driest months, when the surface flow slows down, when the rains stop, when you'd expect the river to weaken, the Nile never actually runs dry. And for a long time, nobody could fully explain why. The answer, according to more recent hydrological research, isn't happening on the surface at all. It's happening underneath it.
Scientists studying the flat plains of Sudan and Egypt discovered something remarkable. Beneath the riverbed itself lies a massive layer of sand and sediment, soaked with water, acting almost like a hidden second river, flowing silently beneath the one we can see. This underground layer is called an alluvial aquifer. And in flat terrain like the Nile Valley, the river and this aquifer are constantly exchanging water, seeping back and forth through the riverbed, like two lungs breathing in sync. When the surface river is high, water seeps down, recharging the aquifer below. When the surface flow drops, that stored underground water slowly seeps back up, quietly feeding the river from beneath, keeping it alive even when the sky above offers nothing. Hydrologists call this base flow, and it's one of the reasons rivers in dry climates around the world don't simply vanish during a drought. But in the Nile's case, the scale of this hidden underground reservoir is staggering. In the Nile Delta alone, researchers have mapped one of the largest freshwater aquifer systems on Earth, a vast underground reserve directly linked to and recharged by the river above it, which means the Nile the ancient Egyptians worshipped as a single visible gift from the gods was never just one river at all. It was two, one flowing in daylight and one flowing in complete darkness beneath their feet, an invisible current the pharaohs never knew existed, quietly making sure their miracle never ran dry. Add to this a warming climate, shifting monsoon patterns, and a growing population across 11 different countries, all depending on the same river. and you start to understand something unsettling. The river that built one of the greatest civilizations in human history, the river ancient Egyptians believed was eternal, a gift from the gods themselves, is now facing a level of uncertainty it has never faced before. Not from drought, not from myth, but from us. The ancient system is breaking, and modern civilization built the crack. For thousands of years, the Nile's flood cycle was untouchable. Empires rose and fell, but the river kept its rhythm. Then, in the 20th century, humans did something the river had never experienced in its entire existence. They stopped it. The construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s was meant to control flooding, generate electricity, and protect Egyptian farmland from unpredictable disasters. And in many ways, it succeeded. But it also did something almost poetic in a tragic way. It ended the very flood cycle that had defined Egyptian civilization since before the pyramids were built. The black silt that once fertilized the fields for free now mostly settles at the bottom of Lake Nasser, the massive reservoir behind the dam. Farmers today rely on artificial fertilizer to replace what the river used to provide naturally every single year for free. And the story doesn't end there. Far upstream, in Ethiopia, a new dam has been rising over the past decade, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, built directly on the Blue Nile, the very river responsible for most of the Nile's total water volume. For Ethiopia, it represents energy independence and economic growth. For Egypt, which depends on the Nile for nearly all of its fresh water, it represents an existential threat. The two nations have spent years in tense negotiations, because for the first time in recorded history, the flow of the Nile is being decided not by nature, but by a small number of engineers and politicians. Now, here's where the story gets even stranger. The Nile isn't actually one river at all. Here's something most people never learn in school. The Nile, as we know it, is actually the merger of two completely separate rivers with two completely different personalities. The first is the Blue Nile, the dramatic, seasonal, sediment-loaded river we just talked about, born in the highlands of Ethiopia from Lake Tana. The second is the White Nile, calmer, steadier, and responsible for keeping the river alive even during the dry months when the Blue Nile slows down. These two rivers meet at Khartoum, in Sudan, and you can actually see it happen. The dark, silty water of the Blue Nile and the paler water of the White Nile flow side by side for a while, before finally blending together. It's one of the most striking natural sights in the world. Two rivers with two different sources, two different climates, and two different chemical compositions, merging into the single river that would go on to build one of history's greatest civilizations. But this raises an even bigger question. If the Blue Nile comes from Ethiopia, where does the White Nile come from? That question alone drove some of the most dangerous expeditions in the history of exploration. For centuries, European explorers obsessed over finding what they called the source of the Nile, believing that whoever found it would go down in history. Expeditions were funded by kings. Explorers battled disease, hostile terrain, and each other, all chasing the same prize. In 1858, an explorer named John Hanning Speke stood at the edge of a massive lake in East Africa and declared he had found it, Lake Victoria, one of the largest freshwater lakes on the planet. But even that wasn't the full answer, because water flows into Lake Victoria from rivers even further away. Streams starting in Rwanda and Burundi, in the mountains near the edge of the Congo rainforest. Which means the ultimate source of the Nile, the very first drop of water that eventually reaches the Mediterranean Sea nearly 4,000 miles later, may begin as a small mountain stream in a country most people couldn't point to on a map. A single drop of rain in Central Africa can travel through 6 or more countries, survive deserts, waterfalls, and dams, and still make it to the pyramids. For thousands of years, the people who depended on this river most understood at least. They built their entire civilization around a mystery they never solved. And in a strange way, modern civilization still hasn't fully solved it either. We've just replaced the myths with dams, and the mystery of where the water comes from with the much harder question of whether it will keep coming at all. If you learned something new today, let me know in the comments which part surprised you the most. The hidden source, the two merging rivers, or the modern battle over the dam. And if you want more forgotten history and unexplained mysteries like this, make sure you're subscribed, because next week, we're uncovering another story that history almost forgot. I'll see you in the next one.